Thank you, Tamar. Thank all of you who are tuning in for this lecture and hopefully the entire series. As Tamar noted, these are not normal times, but it's in fact doubly important to all of us during these unsettled and worrisome times to have an opportunity to actually sit together, to talk together. The togetherness of this experience is something that I think is good for all of those concerned. I do want to send this lecture out there with a particular dedication to my cousin Armand Derfner, who has for many, many years led a long career in civil rights cases as an attorney in Mississippi and in South Carolina. And it's very appropriate that we mention him in connection with the topic of this series, but also a special word of prayer to Armand Derfner's nephew, Alon, a soldier in the IDF who at present is serving on the front. So we all pray for his safe return and all of our other soldiers and hostages. Now the topic before us, as we know, is Jews and the American Civil Rights Movement. The program is broken up into three parts, three installments. Today we'll be dealing with what I call the road to desegregation, and we'll be talking about events that took place from the early part of the 20th century up through the 1950s and indeed up to the first years of the 1960s, up until the March on Washington in '63. The 50s, and in particular 1954, we are now 70 years after the landmark Supreme Court decision that marked the end, the legal end at any rate, of the separate but equal doctrine that had ruled American legislation, particularly in the South, up until 1954, and we are observing a 70 years anniversary this year of that landmark decision. So that's the installment for today. Next week, we'll be looking at the Black-Jewish Alliance a little bit more closely and how both the Civil Rights Movement and the Black-Jewish Alliance were interconnected with the emergence of a new kind of political culture, and particularly what is sometimes called the counterculture, a culture of dissent, debate, demonstrations, sit-ins, and so forth. Finally, in the last segment, the third segment, we'll be looking at Black power and Jewish identity and how the Black-Jewish Alliance began to, shall we say, loosen and even to some extent fall apart. So let's begin, without further ado, with the first part, as I say, this road to desegregation, because that was the main agenda during these early phases of the civil rights era. On the first slide, you will see part of a poster. It's an FBI poster, in fact, from 1963, following the disappearance and, as it turned out, the murder of three civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, the three young men who were killed. And as you can tell perhaps by the surnames of the two fellows on the left and in the center, they came from Jewish families, 2 out of the 3. And therefore, it's a symbolic way of leading into this question of how is it that Jews in the United States became involved in the movement for civil rights. And I'll try and break down the process of this involvement into several different stages, if you will, or aspects, dimensions. The first one of these dimensions I'll talk about is where Jewish activists and black activists and others met on what we might call the platform of human rights. I'll also discuss briefly at this point the question of race, and that's something that will come up for longer discussion in parts 2 and 3 of this series. I will touch on the fact that the American Jewish population, as always, was distributed across the country, and there are therefore some interesting differences to be observed between Jews who lived in the north and Jews who lived in the south. We'll take a look at whether or not discrimination was a common issue for both Jewish activists and black activists, and how that question figured into this Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. And finally, we'll end with the gestation of what's known as the struggle, the movement, the civil rights movement that we associate with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington, leading up to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Now, let's start with human rights. What do we mean by that? And here, let me take you back all the way to the very beginning of the 20th century, because whether it was a coincidence or not a coincidence, but there were several events that stirred, or series of events that stirred emotions and activity in the early years of the 20th century, centering around violations, gross violations of people's human rights, people's rights at the most basic level of the right to life. And I will mention in one parenthesis, as it were, the infamous pogrom that took place in the Russian Empire in the Bessarabian city of Kishinev in 1903. Many of you may have heard of it. And the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which was founded in New York in 1909, just several years later. Why am I putting these issues together, and why is there a picture of post-pogrom victims in Kishinev on the left side of your screen, and a photo taken of a victim of a lynching in the South in the United States on the right side of the screen? I've also included a quote for you from several years later, actually from 1917 in the Yiddish daily newspaper Vorwärts. You may know it in its English version today, Forward, and the commentary at the time following race riots in St. Louis. The comment was, Kishinev and St. Louis, the same soil, the same people, twin sisters that could easily be mistaken for one another. How did this come about, this twinning, as it were, this desire to see violations of the basic human rights of Jewish people at that time in the Tsarist Empire in Russia, and the gross violation of the rights of Black Americans in the United States? How did this come to be spliced together? Well, for one thing, both problems were very much in evidence in the press, in American public opinion, in political discourse. The Kishinev pogrom was no local affair. It was a scandal that shook the world press. It was carried constantly in the news in the West and in the United States as well, so much so that it became more or less a household word. And the fact that people who were talking about Kishinev and the pogrom, where Jews were killed, maimed, raped, looted, and so forth, they were speaking about those issues at the same time that people were saying, well, look, right here at home, we have these problems occurring on an almost daily basis. And shouldn't we be concerned with the human rights of these people as well as these people? It was a time known as the progressive era in American history when activists who took it upon themselves to speak for the victims, the little people, the people who needed to be lifted up, as it were, and given the benefits of basic rights. It was a formative period in the United States, in American political culture, and it's no accident that these two, the Jews who were being victimized in pogroms and African Americans who were being victimized by acts of violence and racial discrimination in the South. It's no accident that these came about in the same years, in the same period in which this new discourse was beginning to develop. I'll give you here several examples of the people who actually founded the NAACP in 1909. Let's start with the picture on the right. You see there three figures, Mary Ovington White, and the couple in sepia, husband and wife, William English Walling, and his wife, Anna Strunsky. Anna Strunsky, a Jew of Russian background, an immigrant to the United States, they had just come back from Kishinev, from the Russian Empire, where they had gone to see what had happened, and as it were, a mission to understand the plight of the Jews, not only in Kishinev, but in the wave of pogroms that rocked the Russian Empire several years afterwards, in 1905 in particular. And they came back to New York, and they spoke with their friends, including Mary Ovington White, and they met together with the idea of not only spreading the news about what was needed to be done to protest the plight of the Jews in Eastern Europe, but also how to use that same impulse and address the problems of racism and racial violence that were plaguing the United States. One of their colleagues and friends, you see him on the left, Joel Spingarn, he was chairman of the board of the NAACP in the years just a bit after its founding, and then later it served as its president in 1930 to 39. So Anna Strunsky, Joel Spingarn, their circle of friends, these are people who took it for granted that the issue of human rights was indivisible, that people who cared about the lives and freedoms of people should care about them no matter who they were and where they lived. Now, the period of time that we've just started to address is, of course, the period of mass immigration of Eastern and Southern European people to the United States, including 2 million Jews. And American immigration law at the time, before World War I, before the 1920s, it was fairly liberal in terms of the admission of free white Europeans. In other words, there were no quota laws, there were no restrictions on the books that applied to people who could be considered free and white immigrants. This was not the case, as you may know, in terms of Chinese immigration, which was already being restricted by 1882. Japanese immigration was also going to be restricted in the early years of the 20th century. And of course, the United States did not admit freely people from Africa and in certain parts of the Middle East. So the question is this: are we talking about migration as a basic human right, or are we talking about an American society, an American social policy and immigration policy that was already structured according to some sort of racial formula? And I would put it to you that the picture is very complex, because on the one hand, Jews, among other Europeans, were considered within the category of free white people who were free to immigrate without restriction. Once again, this is before World War I, before the quota system was initiated between 1921 and 1924. On the other hand, the United States as a country, the administration, the Congress, various departments of government were beginning to be concerned about what they considered to be the over-diversification of the American people, and they began to classify the immigrants from Europe according to their ethnic origins. And they used the word race, races and peoples of the world, and everyone who came into the United States was classified according to the race or people to which they belonged. After 1899, Jews too were classified as they entered. They were called Hebrews. That was the designation that the Jews preferred. However, the problem here is this. If one sees the United States in the early part of the 20th century, it is simplistic to think of it as merely divided, merely, in quotes, merely divided according to racial lines, black and white, as it were, or even if we expand the color formula a bit, brown, red, and so forth. That wasn't the case in the early part of the 20th century, when race was a far more elastic kind of category, and Jews, as well as Italians, as well as Poles, as well as a myriad of peoples, some of whom were immigrating in large numbers to the United States, were considered to belong to racial groups themselves, and there was a hierarchy. And lo and behold, when quotas were enacted in the early 1920s, there was a hierarchy. There was a heavy and advantageous policy towards heavier immigration from Northern and Western Europe, the Scandinavian countries, the British Isles, Germany, and so forth, and a drastic restriction imposed on peoples coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the rationale behind that sliding scale, that discriminatory scale of migration, had everything to do with this idea that people from Southern and Eastern Europe, Jews included, were part of the inferior races of the world. And so we begin to see around the time of the First World War and into the 1920s, something else is coming together in terms that we already have a large American Jewish community. It's becoming more and more organized. The American Jewish Congress, which I've put up here on the screen, was one of the new organizations to be founded in the early 20th century, founded twice, in fact, in 1917 during World War I, and then refounded in 1927 under the guidance of Rabbi Stephen Wise. The American Jewish Congress started out during the First World War as a forum that got together to try and ensure the safeguarding of Jewish human and civil rights in Eastern Europe once World War I would end. By the time it was reorganized in the 1920s, it had expanded its agenda to include American social problems. And not to give too much away to begin with, but the American Jewish Congress after the Second World War was going to become one of the standard bearers on the American Jewish street of Jewish participation in civil rights activities and the promotion of the cause of civil rights. So that's what we have here. And the question already then, I think, would be, why did Jews who were in the midst of their own critical period of mass migration, early stages of integrating into American society, why was it important to some of them to begin to look around and to see that American society was not all of a piece, that there were different peoples, their neighbors looked different, they spoke different languages, and this involvement of Jews with their neighbors begins in this period of the mass migration and the beginnings of large Jewish organizations. And once again, I put it to you that it's a critical period in American political history when questions of race and rights, immigration rights, civil rights, basic human rights, these were still in the air. Race itself was one of the issues, not the only issue, but let me pause for a moment to say one thing about it. Race in the sense that today in the United States is much more readily recognized. In other words, the color question. I've put up a picture of Al Jolson in blackface, one of the important entertainers in the 1920s era in the United States. All of you probably remember him from The Jazz Singer and elsewhere. And minstrel shows and blackface, of course, today is considered one of the worst cultural crimes that white society committed against black people in terms of the racial put-down that's involved, the mockery that's involved, and so forth, the white masquerading as black. The jury is still out in terms of Jolson and other entertainers, including some other Jewish entertainers who were popular at the time and occasionally did use the medium of blackface. The jury is still out on whether or not, when they did it, were they doing it in order to express some sort of identification with people who were weaker and needed to be represented, or were they doing it as part of their own Americanization, their own adoption of white cultural norms? I put it to you that these two options, and they're not the only options out there of how to view this, but it does speak to this question of how complex the issues are when looking back 100 years ago and trying to figure out what was it about racial issues in the United States that began to draw attention not only generally but also within the Jewish community in the United States and some of its representatives. The other picture that you see up here on the screen is from one of the important trials that took place in the early part of the 20th century, the famous case of the Scottsboro Boys, as they were known, accused of crimes against white women in Alabama, and it was a cause célèbre. People were talking about it constantly. It was one of the major politicized trials in American legal history. And here, among the young men who were the prisoners, the victims of this frame-up, and also with their guards, you see one of their lawyers, one Samuel Leibowitz, who was contracted to be one of the defense team. Once again, this question arises of why it is that Jewish professionals and Jewish organizations might feel it necessary and indeed imperative for them to be involved. And this question of why is something that we'll carry on discussing as we move along. Let's just take a moment to remember, as I intimated earlier, that the American Jewish population then as well as now is distributed in different parts of the country. The fact that Jews were living in the South meant that, and we're talking about the time of Jim Crow, we're talking about actual legalized segregation in facilities ranging from where people lived to where they could shop or where they could eat and so forth. And Jews in the South are going to play a certain role in this larger story of the civil rights movement, American Jews, Jewish-Black relations, and so forth. It's easy to understand more or less the terms of the conflict people went through in the South, whether or not they personally believed that racial segregation was a good thing or a bad thing. For the most part, white people in the South, Jews included, tended to accept the social and political and legal norms of their environment. And there were exceptions, of course. And not only were there exceptions, but some of the people living in the South were served by rabbis who came from outside the South and were certainly trained outside the South in places like Cincinnati at the Hebrew Union College or in other rabbinical seminaries. And these were people coming from the North. As we go along, we're going to see that this question of North and South is going to turn into one of the more critical issues. The other thing, however, is that most of the African American population in the early part of the 20th century was still living in the South. And it was only after about 1910, as we move into the second and third and fourth decades of the 20th century, that masses of Black Americans begin to move out of the South and relocate in cities, for the most part, in the North and in the Midwest and the West. As many as 6 million of them relocated from the South to the North and elsewhere. And that, in a sense, meant that if before World War I, it was in some way almost possible to conceive of the American race question as something pertaining to the former Confederacy, to the South, that is no longer possible once we get past the 1910s and 20s, when it's much clearer that this question of relations between Americans of different racial groups and origin groups, that is an issue that is nationwide. And it's going to have its impact on, therefore, to come back to our topic, it's going to have an impact not only on Jews living in the South, but it's going to have an impact on Jews living in major cities in the North, which is where, in fact, the Jews were concentrated. I give you here two very symbolic and brief examples. One from a typical street in Brownsville, Brooklyn, around the summer of 1942. If you have very good eyesight, you can see on the butcher shop there is the standard sign outside, Basar Kosher, or Basar Kasher, for those of you who identify more with Israeli Hebrew. Brownsville, Brooklyn is one of the neighborhoods in New York City which becomes very much mixed between Jews and African Americans, as the years go on, from the 1920s on, it becomes a focal point for Jews and blacks living more or less in the same neighborhoods, very, very in close proximity. Similarly, I give you an example from Newark, New Jersey. One of the synagogues there, which actually still exists, it is now a Jewish historical museum. At any rate, I bring you these pictures just to remind us that this question of Jews and their black neighbors is a question that is no longer something that concerns Jews in the South. It's also something that concerns Jews in the North. Now, moving on just a bit, we're still in the period in which discrimination on the basis of religion is still widespread. And here in particular, I've given you a couple of examples where the discrimination was aimed at Jews. You see on the swimming pool sign on the left that says that the privilege are extended to approved Gentiles. The ad for the Miami Beach Hotel on the right, restricted clientele. Restricted is a euphemism that meant Jews not allowed. And I put it to you that here we're still in the era between the two world wars and even just a bit after, when the idea of race was not the sole issue of contention in American society. There were different forms of social distancing, discrimination, prejudice, bigotry, and so forth. And if we take a look at how Jews are going to become more and more receptive to the idea that they have something at stake in the fight for civil equality, we have to bear in mind that Jews were still being discriminated against, not only in hotels, swimming pools, and resorts, but also in employment, in universities and colleges, and in the professions. Now, once we get past the Second World War, Jews in general, knowing what happened in Europe to the Jewish people because of the Nazis and the Holocaust, are going to have some special attitude or approach to anything having to do with minorities under pressure, minorities being discriminated against, minorities being defined as other, as separate, and being put down. The slide shows you Eleanor Roosevelt holding a copy of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was promulgated in 1948, just on the heels, of course, of the end of the Second World War. It was intended to create a way forward for the world to rebuild, the free world, to rebuild a form of society which would not descend into the chaos, destruction, and wholesale murder that everyone saw in the Second World War and in the Holocaust. It was a declaration of intent. In the United States, 1948, we're still in Jim Crow. We still have states with racial discrimination on the books. We still have many places in the United States where Jews are being discriminated against, and so forth. So we'll bear that in mind for a moment, and the landmark decision that I referred to earlier in the famous case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, we're talking about the landmark United States Supreme Court decision knocking down the idea that separate schools were okay on the basis of separate but equal. The Supreme Court ruled that by being separate, they were no longer equal, and therefore desegregation had to become a matter of policy, had to be implemented by the states, and had to be enforced. And this is the hinge on which history begins to turn. As we begin the 1950s, we're already in the classic civil rights era. 1945, the state of New York, the state legislature, already is starting to put on the books a non-discrimination clause having to do with employment. And you'll see on the right that among the groups supporting this bill and helping to get it passed through the New York State legislature was the American Jewish Congress, along with the NAACP and the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, prominent personalities such as Thurgood Marshall, who was the legal counsel for the NAACP, Mike Quill of the Transport Workers Union, and very important in New York state politics, certainly at the time, organized labor, in which Jews also were involved. So we have the sense that things are beginning to move forward on that discrimination front. However, I don't know if you can see it properly on my screen. It looks a little bit off kilter, but the implementation of this 1945 New York State law was actually quite restricted. It was limited to questions of employer and employee, and it was noted specifically in the opinion of those who drafted the law to have attempted fuller inclusion, that is to say, to address other forms of discrimination, such as rental housing and what have you, or other facilities, that would have, quote, aroused resentment, risked constitutional inhibitions, and would have been most unwise in this initial stage. In other words, people, even those supporting anti-discrimination legislation, were taking it slow. They were saying, let's take baby steps, and this, of course, was one of the grievances that would feed the civil rights movement, saying, no, these baby steps were simply insufficient. But one more thing before we leave this slide, and that is, we're still talking about the 40s and the 50s. We're talking about a time when Jews perceive themselves to be victims of discrimination, when they see what happened in Europe and they understand that to make America safe for them, for the Jews, America needs to be a country without racialized legislation, without legal forms of discrimination and so forth. Not only that, but the 1940s and 50s are the classic period in which Jewish organizations are sponsoring what became known as prejudice studies. That is to say, research projects aimed at studying how prejudice works. How does bigotry work? And the idea that was the leading idea at the time is that you cannot really separate one form of prejudice from another. Those who hate Jews also hate black people, also hate this one, also hate that one. In other words, prejudice as such is a syndrome. It's symptomatic of deep social ills. And if one were to try to address these systemic problems in American society, it wouldn't be enough to do it for one group. One needed to approach all of these problems all in a bundle. And that, again, helps us to understand how not only the American Jewish Congress, but also prominent rabbis and various other individuals were getting the picture, were getting the point that this was going to be a joint struggle or none at all. Now, the Jews were not the only ones who were getting this picture, that Jews were becoming more and more involved in this issue of civil rights and anti-segregation or desegregation. In fact, there was a backlash by white supremacists against Jews, particularly in the South and Midwest, during the years 1957 and 1958. In other words, just a couple of years after Brown versus Board of Education, just a couple of years after the beginning of the desegregation efforts in the South, 8 instances in which synagogues were firebombed or dynamited or attempted to be dynamited. Luckily, in those 8 cases that covered about a year and a half to 2 years, in Nashville, in Miami, in Birmingham, in Atlanta, in Peoria, Illinois, in Jacksonville, nobody was actually hurt, luckily. Most of these incidents occurred at night. Nevertheless, it was very alarming. And just to take a brief parenthesis here, when wondering, well, what is it that we think about today that has some relevance to these events of 70 years ago, I put it to you that perhaps the question of does American society sometimes erupt in incidents of violence directed against Jews? And the answer is yes. It happened then, and there are alarming signs that something of that sort is happening once more. We'll end, as I say, with the gelling of all of this in the classic years of the early civil rights struggle, the events of 1963, the campaign to make desegregation work, to assure voting rights equally for black people as well as white people, and the involvement of Jews in the forefront of those activities. On the top left, you'll see from the year of the March in Washington. This photo comes from Arlington at the National Cemetery, where Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and other figures were flanking Martin Luther King Jr. A demonstration in Montgomery, Alabama, the picture below on the left, including representatives of the American Jewish Congress. And finally, we'll end where we began, with the murder of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney in Philadelphia, Mississippi. These activists, young men who lost their lives to a mob of bloodthirsty white supremacists. We'll, I think, stop now in order to allow for some discussion of questions that you may have and that I believe Tamar has been collecting from the chat room, and it leaves a little bit time for question and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eli, for presenting this historical period, which may be unknown to everybody. So our first question is, how much impact did Harry Truman's desegregation of the armed forces have on civil rights? Did this affect the Jewish community or leadership?
That's a good question. Of course, desegregation begins at the federal level. It begins with the Army. It comes from the White House. But in order for the desegregation policy as a whole to penetrate to the states themselves, into the grassroots of American society, a few more steps had to be taken. The desegregation of the armed forces was an important step, but it certainly didn't address the real problems of segregation in schools, in housing, in jobs. It didn't begin to address the question of voting rights, where, as a matter of course, black citizens, especially in the South, were simply prevented from registering to vote. So that, you know, this step by Truman and before him, in fact, Eisenhower's, FDR and Truman, and afterwards Eisenhower, the three presidents, went on record in favor of desegregating the federal government and its arms, including the armed forces. But this was only the tip of the iceberg, and therefore I would say that it had no particular impact with reference to Jews, nor did it have a particular impact on other Americans. It had an important impact on people in uniform. I would maybe add one further note in that regard. We're talking about people who were drafted to the Army. The United States at the time, serving in the Army was not a choice. You were drafted. It was, of course, coming out of the Second World War, on the brink of the Korean War. People were being drafted, and people who served their country in uniform and sometimes fell in battle or were wounded and then came back and wanted their society to respect them for what they had done, for their commitment to the country, and they came back to an American society. On the one hand, they felt themselves more empowered to demand that their rights be respected. Jewish veterans, as well as African American veterans, as well as Japanese American veterans and so forth, came back from the Second World War and were part of the civil rights struggle because of their sense of empowerment, because of their sense that the country was obliged to them for their years of service. And that a country that said that it was fighting for democracy could not sanction violations of democracy on a systemic level. So to that extent, yes, the whole package still holds together.
Okay, now another question relating to the picture you showed earlier of the entrance to the pool, so the swimming pool in Miami, I think. So how can you explain why approved Gentiles means definitely not Jews and not all non-Gentiles?
Well, there's Jews and there's Gentiles. Those are the categories. When it says approved Gentiles, it means no Jews allowed. That's in plain English. The idea being, if you're going to, conduct a pool or a club, a country club or a hotel or a resort, the people who are the entrepreneurs behind that and the people who are the customers, the clientele, if they want an exclusive environment, then there are some people that they just don't want to share these facilities with. And Jews were among the people who simply were not wanted. One of the reasons why Jews bought hotels and went into the hotel business was precisely in order not to have to deal with that. For the same reasons, Jews got tired of being blocked out of law school and medical school and other professional schools and went ahead after World War II and started their own university. Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, was a direct response to discrimination against Jewish students and faculty in the professional schools and universities in between the two world wars.
Why did the U.S. military include Hebrew on Jewish soldiers' dog tags if desegregation was started while the U.S. was fighting Germany?
Well, dog tags, as you probably know, included the religion of the servicemen and women. This was so that they could be attended to properly by military chaplains, in particular, of course, in cases of people who were wounded or killed in battle. The Catholics had a C, the Protestants had a P, the Jews had an H. These were simply for purposes of assuring the servicemen that they would be given proper religious attention should they need it in battle conditions. This was a completely separate subject. It had nothing to do with discrimination of any sort. And in fact, the word Hebrew, as I mentioned earlier, was a term that Jews preferred to be used back at the turn of the 20th century. So Jews was a put down, but Hebrews, oh, that's something a bit more respectable.
So actually, Yosh now added on the chat who said that he has friends whose father got new tags when they were fighting against the Nazis, where the H was changed to a P in case they were captured.
That also happened, yes.
think we'll take one last question. So, how were the relations between the Wilson administration and the Jewish communities while Wilson desegregated the federal government?
Okay, Wilson, we're going way back again, back to the years just before the First World War and during the First World War. Wilson didn't start any social revolutions going. It was hard enough for him to try and run the country and during the First World War. Wilson was president who enjoyed a great deal of support and popularity among voters, Jews included. In fact, it's Wilson as a Democrat who begins to be, that's at the very, very beginning of the Jewish move towards the Democratic Party. Before Wilson, the Republican Party, which was far more liberal in those days than it is today, the Republican Party drew a lot of Jewish voters before Wilson. Wilson is the first Democratic president to begin this trend in which Jews are more and more likely to vote for the candidate of the Democratic Party. Wilson, you might remember, is also the American president who did his utmost to support Great Britain in issuing the Balfour Declaration in 1917. There was a good vibe coming from the White House in terms of Jewish issues at the time.
So it all comes back to here. So there are a few more questions, so I'll just take one more question. This will be the last one. Can you comment on the impact that the film Gentleman's Agreement had on the public?
Well, I was too young to be impacted by that film. I do remember the film, of course. I've seen it once or twice. Yes, Gentleman's Agreement, for those of you who may not have seen it, it's a wonderful movie. Gregory Peck exposes the deep inroads of polite anti-Semitism in the ranks of the American white upper class, or upper middle and upper class, and how terrible it is, particularly because we're already after the Second World War, and one of the major characters is a Jewish soldier, a war veteran, and so there is this issue involved of, well, shouldn't Jews be equally privileged with all of the rights of being American if they had the obligation of fighting for the United States during the war? And it was a book and then the film about this insidious nature of anti-Semitism where people deny that they hate Jews, but behind the Jews' backs, they just don't want anything to do with them and they push them away. I think at the time, we're talking at a very, very sensitive point in history, not only in the United States, but in general, in which, because of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, which was rife and widespread before the Second World War, goes into a nosedive in terms of American public opinion. People no longer feel comfortable in public opinion polls saying that they dislike Jews, or they prefer not to have anything to do with Jews, or they believe Jews have too much power or too much money or too much influence and that sort of thing. In the 1950s, this begins as a long trend downward from the 50s on into the 60s. Anti-Semitism becomes almost a non-issue. And a gentleman's agreement comes about right at the I would say at the top of that slide, where anti-Semitism is still perceived as a big issue. And that's why it's in those early 50s when Jewish organizations saw themselves as equal partners with the black community in fighting against discrimination of any sort, bigotry of any sort, and as I pointed out earlier, this idea that, well, actually, people who hate people, they don't make any distinction. They hate Jews, they hate blacks, they hate these, and they hate those. And this idea that all prejudices are the same after all, and therefore we all have to get into this fight together. And of course, Jews were punished for saying that by having their synagogues firebombed in in the South. No white minister in the South had his church firebombed because he spoke up about the civil rights of black people. It didn't happen in white churches, but it did happen in synagogues, and there is something to ponder.
Okay, I think we'll end with that and ponder. Thank you very much, Eli. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Chagai, Ashraf, and Yishai, our team on our side here. We hope you continue with us in our next session next week. Thank you.